Greetings, Upstanders. Dr. O here. And one of the things that bothered me over the weekend, starting on Friday, was the way in which these networks were platforming border quote unquote czar Tom Homan. And I was most frustrated by what I saw with Morning Joe. I didn't expect Joe Scarborough to go hard on him. I mean, the idea, Joe Scarborough has always been someone who's talked about the borders and border security and getting rid of people who are criminals and the like. But at the same time, in fairness, Joe Scarborough has also been saying, go with the Constitution, give people due process as relates to Kilmar, Abrego Garcia, and the like. And so he's definitely been critical of what the Trump administration has been doing. But he should have absolutely went hard on Homan. It's very problematic, some of the things that he didn't say. One of the things that I noticed as I was taking my notes was that he kept letting Homan say that he was basically going to defer to the government of El Salvador. Like, why would you do that? Before Senator Van Hollen came back, we were told that the United States government was paying $6 million to house these people who were sent to El Salvador in this concentration camp known as CCOT. That's what we were told. Van Hollen came back and said it's actually $15 million. And so you're going to tell me that if the United States government said that you need to release him or have him sent home so he can have due process, that they wouldn't listen to that? So it was problematic that Joe would let him continue to make that argument. Another thing is that there was no pushback on this idea of using the Foreign Enemies Act. This whole idea about this being an act. We're not at war with Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela, they're deporting people from Venezuela and or not deporting, they're kidnapping and exporting these people from Venezuela to El Salvador. We're not at war with Venezuela, right? So this idea of using the Foreign Enemies Act, why not question him on that? Because Tom Homan kept saying, well, we're following the law, we're following the laws on the books. The laws on the books say that you got to be at war. We're not at war with Venezuela. So, what are we talking about here? That's a pressing question that should be asked. One of the things that he talked about was this idea of, we're deporting people, deporting. Like I said, we're exporting and kicking them out and sending them to concentration camps, not deporting people to prisons, because that's not the process. It's not happening. This idea of, these are guys that are the worst of the worst. If you're in this country and you're violating the laws and you're not supposed to be here, we're gonna get you. And I've been doing this in '84. And one group that Joe did not bring up, he did not bring up students. He did not bring up, because the students who are here on student visas were here legally. And Homan said we're getting people who aren't following the process, who cut the line, all this other type of stuff. You know how hard it is to get a student visa to come here to the United States? And there was no mention about that. No mention about, then there was conversation about people self-deporting, and that'll help take care of it. And Joe Scarborough said, you think this will help? And Tom Homan was like, absolutely. They can come and set up an appointment. Well, the follow-up question from Joe Scarborough should have been to ask the question about, what's the brother's name? The other Columbia student, Mohsen Madawi, who said that he was called by ICE to come in for an appointment, and he was surprised because it was earlier than his normally scheduled appointment, and he went in anyway, called Columbia University as well, and they detained him, and now they're trying, to get rid of him as well. The sister from Tufts University, all people following the program. How do you not bring up student visa holders, of which over 1,000 have had their student visas revoked right as the semester is about to end? That's a real question. That's a real conversation to have. And we know that at best, some of these revocations that have happened have been questionable at best. Somebody like Madawi was somebody who was calling for peace, who was saying that, he was condemning anti-Semitism just as he was supporting Palestinians being free, saying that the destinies were intertwined. No commentary about that. Then, he asked, and then there was some weird, like, I don't know if it was like a whataboutism, bringing up the fact that Homan also worked under the Obama administration. Like, what was the point in doing that? What was the point in saying that? Because Obama, who did deport more people than Trump, yeah, he did it through the process and did it legally. And we could have conversations about that, whether it's problematic and the numbers and so on and so forth. But he actually followed the process. So why even throw in that little Obama point, right? And then Joe kept asking him at the end, are you going to follow the Supreme Court? You're going to follow the Supreme Court. And what did Homan say? We're going to follow the law. Well, when you saw Trump going against the governor of Maine, about the trans athletes policy, what did he say? We are the law. So whose law are you determining, right? Because even as the Supreme Court made a decision, they still had buses going towards the airport. And these are just the buses that people are catching that are turning around. We don't know if some other ones are flying out right now. And some of these people who are on these buses are not criminals at all. And so I feel like, when these things are talked about, if you're gonna have these guys on who should not be platformed, I wish Joe Scarborough would have asked him about the thousand people who protested in front of his home, about the people who are the wife, the mother, and three children ages 9 to 18 who were taken, basically in his neighborhood, who were eventually released, and why things like that are happening after people stood up and protested there. So I'm just looking down at some of the other things to make sure I didn't miss anything. Um, and then lastly, the whole question about this idea of deporting Americans. Why not have or I should say, exporting Americans or kicking Americans out because you can't deport a U.S. citizen? Why not ask that question? Put Homan on the books. Make him be able to say, no, we're not going to do that. But that didn't happen either. And so I don't feel like Tom Homan should be platformed in any way, shape, or form. But if people are going to do it, they need to go harder with the questions. Again, I didn't expect what I would ask Homan if he was joining the UPstanders podcast. That ain't happening. But I didn't expect that type of contentious interview from Joe Scarborough. But I also noticed that when he interviews these types of Republicans and people who work for this administration, no one else on the panel gets to ask questions. So I think that's also problematic as well. So I think it's very problematic that Homan is being platformed. And then when Joe did press him a little bit, Joe would pull it back and say, "Hey, look, I know you're not a lawyer." When he starts asking him questions about the legal process, like kind of giving him an out. And then when Homan was a little bit, flustered about some of the things, he would say, "I'm not a lawyer." What's happening with this administration is barbaric and it's savage and it's disgraceful. People are being kidnapped and they're not being sent to a prison, they're being sent to a concentration camp. They're not being deported because they didn't go through the process, actual deportation process. And I appreciate what Mika Brzezinski has been doing on Morning Joe and constantly questioning the vocabulary that we're using. And also bringing up the fact that, we're talking about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but she's like, with these other 300 as well, we don't know all of the stories. We don't know the truth. We don't know the full truth. And that needs to be recognized as well. The press needs to stop giving this government a pass. What it's doing is against the law. What it's doing is against the Constitution. What it's doing is against the Supreme Court. And these people need to have due process. And that's what we need to be doing. And for these Democrats out there saying Van Hollen's spending too much time on one person, first of all, it's his constituent. Second of all, international law is being violated because if you're detained, you're supposed to have access to counsel, which Garcia got none of. And what would these guys be doing if it was their constituents? If I was somebody who had a Democratic senator or governor, hey Newsom, or a representative in my state, and they were saying that people are paying too much attention to this one case, I would be nervous about what these guys would do to stick their head out for me if something happened. So, platform Homan if you want, but go hard and let people know, put them on blast in ways that other people like on networks like Fox are just not going to do. That's the least you could do. You owe that to the people. What do y'all think? Holler, let me know in the comments. Peace.